So what is this whole model view CVMP? Once again, patterns. So it's not an exact science, it's giving you general ideas on how to implement your software. And it includes standard modules. Modules like the model, which is the data, business logic in there. You have the view, which is the presentation layer, and finally that C or VM or P, which is kind of the glue logic that pulls the view and the model together. It's based on a separation of duties, and as we're talking about this and going through this for the next hour, keep that in the back of your mind. Separation of duties. You see it inside of internal controls, inside of systems. You see it inside of the solutions framework and separation of the different team members and so forth. This is actual software module separation. And really, how is this different from N-tier back in the 90s? Anybody remember DNA out there? I remember speaking on it in tech ed back in the 90s. I'm dating myself now. But that really gave you a tier type of a approach, separating out, but not really a pattern on how best to do it. So what we're going to do is take that a little bit further and start looking at the different patterns. All have similar goals. They basically just have a different tool set in ways to achieve them. The goals: modularity, flexibility, testability, maintainability. And this is all achieved through that separation of duties. I call it separation of duties. You'll see a lot of separation of concerns in the documentation out there. But this is the whole idea. Once you get this separation of duties, this separation of concerns, then becomes testable, a huge part of it. It's a lot easier to maintain. You can make changes on the fly a lot easier. And of course, it is modular. So let's take a look at this first one, and we'll take a look at it in the context of ASP.NET MVC 3. Model View Controller, first described 1979. Small talk at Xerox PARC. Amazing how much stuff those guys came out with. However, they never really got a whole lot of money out of it. So the controller is the centerpiece in this one. Decouples the model and view. So you have something like a user interaction event coming in. The controller grabs the event, converts it to a user action that the model can understand. The model, that's the behavior of the data, the business logic and the data for the application domain. The view interacts with the controller and directly with the model to generate a user interface. So if we go and take a look at our schematics, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, and this line should be going this way and so forth. But if we look at our standard client server, and basically it was that ASP.NET app that I was showing you, it had the client, it had the business objects built right into the client, no real separation there. Well, separation in that there was code behind. And it's going back to the server with their business objects and data. Basically what happens here is this client then gets split out into this type of a model. And notice the central theme, the controller. It's the one that connects both the view and the model. And if you look at ASP.NET MVC, it's really a kind of a variation of this known as Model 2, where pretty much everything's supposed to go through the controller. However, you still can bind directly into the model. There's also something known as an observer pattern. Maybe you need to have a scenario where there is like stock quotes coming in, and they need to be updated into the view immediately. Then you might have some indirect connections going back and forth, communicating those individual changes directly into the view back into the controller. The model view presenter type of a pattern. Something that originated early in the 1990s, derivative of MVC, really two types of implementation: passive view, a supervising controller type of implementation. In here, the presenter now becomes that MVC controller. The view, that's responsible for handling the UI events. The model, strictly a domain model, so no interaction directly between the view and the model. So more of a user interface-centric type of a scenario. So notice here, we have the presenter being broken out from the controller. We have an indirect relationship from the model, and we go back and forth between the view. Notice no direct type of binding into the model at all. And notice here, you get to this type of a scenario through an interface. And we use dependency injection to be able to create this type of a scenario. Once again, we're doing this separation of duties, separation of concerns. So model, view, view, model. Largely based on MVC. It's actually a specialization of the MVP pattern known as the presentation model. So a little background here. However, it was built specifically for WPF and Silverlight environments. Model and view, just like MVC. However, this view model is a separation from the individual model by becoming a model of the view. So it extends the model with behaviors the view could use. So we're going to actually take that rating class and extend it with behaviors the views could use. It'll data bind between the view and model, and it passes commands between the view and model. So here we see comparing it to an MVP passive type of a scenario. We're getting the direct connects between the view and model, and then an indirect connection through a binding and eventing model built in